Thanks for tuning into my video, English 7 students. This is Mr. Washington, and today you'll be watching the first in a series of videos created specifically for this English 7 class. Today, we're going to be talking about fiction. We're going to be taking notes that will go into the class notes section of your binder. To be prepared for this presentation, you're going to need a copy of the Intro to Fiction Cornell notes that were passed out in class. If you don't have these notes because you are doing them from home or because you were absent from class, you can either get a copy from Mr. Washington or print them out yourself by visiting fcps.blackboard.com. The first thing you'll want to do is put your heading in the upper right-hand corner of the page. There's a place for name, class and period, and date. It's important that you put this information at the top because every now and then a paper may become separated from you, and it's easier to return it to you as long as you have that information there. Once you've headed your paper, then you're ready to proceed. Now, if you're viewing this presentation and I seem to be speaking too fast, remember that this is a video and you can always pause or rewind so that you can copy any information that you might be missing. Once you have a heading, the next thing you'll need to do is look at the topic of the notes, which is located at the top middle of the page. The topic is the most important thing because it tells you what the notes are about and it makes it easy to find them again when you need them. The topic of these notes is Introduction to Fiction. Before we delve too deeply into reading some of the different types of fiction, we're going to need to define what fiction is and identify some of its elements. Elements, simply put, are things that comprise something else. So all fiction is going to be made up of these elements. Oh, and one more thing. As we are going through the presentation, you'll notice that some of the slides will have a little blue pen icon in the upper left-hand corner that looks something like this. When you see this icon, it means that there's something for you to write down. If you don't see the icon, that means there isn't anything to write down, but there is something important for you to pay attention to.
The next thing we need to look at the top of the page is the essential question. This is the question that a teacher is trying to answer through the process of going through the lesson. So the whole purpose of us doing what we're doing right now is to answer this essential question. The essential question for these notes is as follows. What common qualities do all works of fiction have? Now what you'll want to do is write this directly at the top of your Cornell notes, just below where you wrote in the topic and your heading information. Something else that we want to look at that you don't have to write down is the objectives. Every teacher, when they begin teaching, looks at an objective, something that they're trying to accomplish as a result of teaching. We have two objectives that we're going to share with you. The first one says this: one of our goals is we want to be able to identify the elements of fiction. The other objective is that we want you to be able to distinguish between fiction and nonfiction. So we have our essential question and our two objectives. Now we're ready to actually take notes. So now we're on the right-hand column of your Cornell notes. This is where all of the notes that you're taking are supposed to go. The first thing we need to do is define what is fiction. On the left-hand column, you'll see a question that says, what is fiction? On the right-hand side, you'll see 3 lines where you can write down the following information. It gives you a definition of fiction. The definition says, a story invented from a writer's imagination. They are made-up stories designed to entertain. Make sure you have this written in the right-hand column. For further explanation, we can say a little bit more about fiction. There are 3 different types of fiction that we want to write down. There are more types of fiction, but The only ones that we are concerned about in 7th grade are these three types of fiction because these are the types of things we do. First, we have short stories. Short stories are stories that are short. They usually revolve around the same idea. every story that is written that's worth reading about has different stages of plot. The next element that we want to talk about is characters. Characters are defined as the people, animals, or creatures who take part in the action of the story. They are the ones that the story is written about. Now, it's not just enough to define characters, because as we go forward, we want to pay attention to a particular type of character in the story. Two types, in fact. So the most important character in a story is called the protagonist. The protagonist is simply the main character in the story. Some people look at the protagonist as the good guy, but the problem with that term is that many protagonists aren't guys. Sometimes they are females, sometimes they are animals that don't have a gender. So we have to look at it simply as the main character in the story, the one whom the story is mainly about. Fighting against the protagonist is an antagonist. An antagonist we can look at sometimes as the villain, but sometimes an antagonist is not a villain. So the best definition would be the character or force working against the protagonist. We say force because it's possible in some stories for the protagonist to be fighting against nature or against society, in which case the antagonist isn't a character at all. Let's take a look at some examples of characters you might be familiar with to help us identify where they fit as a protagonist or an antagonist. In the previous slide, we took a look at Batman, very popular character. He's the protagonist of the Batman series. An antagonist for Batman, and he has many of them, many different enemies, but the one we think about first is the Joker. Protagonist versus antagonist. Let's look at another one. If Harry Potter is our protagonist, who would be our antagonist? Well, of course, it would be he who will not be named, otherwise known as Voldemort. In the Harry Potter series, these are the two people who were fighting against one another. In our final example, we're going to take a look at the protagonist from the Hunger Games series, Katniss Everdeen. If Katniss is the protagonist, who is the antagonist? Well, this one's a little tougher because she's not fighting against a single character at different points in the story. She's working against other people, but often those people are only fighting against her because they're being forced to. So who's doing the forcing in this story? The best way to look at it is that in the Hunger Games series, the antagonist really is the Capitol, which can be symbolized by everything from the people who are living there to the president to a variety of other things. So when we look at Katniss Everdeen, we have to look at really all of the people that she's fighting against. So this is one of those cases where instead of fighting against a character, she's fighting against a force. In this case, the force of society making her fight when she really doesn't want to. 3 good examples of protagonist and antagonist. The next element that we need to look at, whoa, my goodness, that was scary. The next element that we need to look at is conflict. Conflict is a struggle between two opposing forces, as symbolized by that loud crashing noise that you just heard. A conflict is a struggle between two or more opposing forces. Now, earlier in our presentation, we saw that plot was a sequence of events in a story. plot is usually going to be built around a central conflict, which is the main problem in a story. So every story that has a plot also has some main problem, some central conflict that the main character is trying to solve, often by working against the antagonist. So when we think about conflict, an interesting picture that we can keep in our minds looks something like this. Two characters struggling against one another. We usually indicate conflict by starting with character versus and then placing an example of what they're fighting against. It could be character versus character, character versus self, character versus nature, etc. But in every story, keep in mind there's going to be a conflict, and the most important, most serious conflict that the protagonist faces is what called the central conflict. Our next element of fiction is theme. A theme is the central idea or a lesson about life that an author wants his or her reader to understand. Every story that we read has something that we can take away, that we can learn from what the character experiences as a result of going through the plot. That lesson or idea that we learn is called the theme. Now, the important thing to keep in mind about theme is that it's rarely stated in the story. You're not going to find a section of the story that says, the theme of this story is blank. Instead, you need to infer what the theme is. So what does it mean to infer? Well, when we infer, what we're doing is we're making an educated guess. So we're trying to figure out what we think the lesson was that the author was trying to teach when they wrote their story. The only way we can be certain is if we use some sort of evidence to support our educated guess. So as you're reading the story, take a look at what the character goes through and what the character learns, because that might be a way of figuring out what the theme is. Our final element of fiction is called setting. Most of us are familiar with what setting is. We know it as the time and place of a story. But we're adding another word into this definition that might be a little bit more complicated, and that is the word duration. Duration simply means how long. So when we talk about duration and setting, it means that we're looking at the time, the when of the story, the place, the where of the story, and the length, the duration of the story. Therefore, in your notes, you'll want to write down that setting tells when, where, and how long a story is. Duration means how long. Make sure you don't forget that, because you will see it again. One other thing that we want to make sure we write down in our notes is that there can be a number of different settings in each story. In fact, it's not unheard of to have dozens or hundreds of different settings in a longer work of fiction like a novel or a play. So when you're asked what the setting is, you may have to identify more than one. Settings can be anything from rain and weather, any duration of time. It can be a place like the beach. It could be warm and sunny. Or it could be a stormy night with thunder and lightning and some creepy individual looking over your shoulder. All of these are examples of settings. So to conclude and to summarize, this year we're going to learn a lot about fiction, but we need to remember that fiction deals with 5 main elements. And those elements again: plot, character, conflict, theme, and of course, setting. Once you're done with these notes, please make sure they go in the class notes section of your binder, and you will see all of these terms again in the future. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in class.